Dr. Dean Radin, great to talk to you after quite a while.
Good to be on your show.
I was trying to think, you were here in Las Vegas for a while, the Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies at UNLV. How long ago was that? And how long have you been working at quantifying psychic abilities?
Well, it was the mid-90s. I actually didn't have the chair. I was working in the Harry Reid Center. I've been working at this now for almost 4 decades. So, which seems kind of frightening to me that it's been 4 decades, but that's what happens.
In general, though, you can now say, with looking at your body of work, psychic abilities, psychic phenomena are quantifiable, are demonstrable. You can prove, even if it's in cases where the measurement is slight, that there is something to measure.
Yeah, we don't like to use proof, the word proof in science. We only use proof when it comes to logic and alcohol. So what we can say then is that we have various degrees of confidence in the phenomena that we study. So we have extremely high degrees of confidence that the basic categories of psychic phenomena are real. And we have that confidence because we're able to do studies in the laboratory that are repeatable in multiple laboratories.
And it takes courage to do this. I mean, you catch heat, right?
Well, it takes courage to do anything that's on the leading edge, not just in science, but as you well know, in politics and everywhere else. If you're doing something on the leading edge, it will be considered controversial, and the status quo doesn't like controversy. So I wouldn't, for myself, I don't think of it as courage as much as simply following where my curiosity leads.
And from the time when you started to now, the things that you have documented and books that you have written, papers that you've had published, have you seen it nudge a little bit? Have you seen at least a general movement toward acceptability from your science colleagues?
Well, I would say in one sense, yes, in that 30 to 40 years ago, almost no one was studying consciousness from a scientific perspective. Philosophers have been studying it for 3,000 years, but to have neuroscientists and now physicists and others who are looking at consciousness as a topic of interest, that has definitely increased. And it's undeniable that when you start looking at consciousness, you start running into strange anomalies. Well, some of those anomalies have to do with what we call psychic phenomena. And so you may not find too much public acknowledgement of interest, but on a private scale, absolutely, it is increasing.
Consciousness kind of a buzzword now. It's dribbled out into the public. People are arguing about it on Twitter now. It's sort of that, I would say, is progress, but people don't always equate consciousness with psychic abilities, although you've sort of been on that path for a long time. Can we even define what consciousness is? Does science know what it is?
Well, that's part of the problem. Science does not know what consciousness is. It doesn't know from where it arises, although in the neurosciences, it is assumed to arise from the brain, even though no one has any idea how that can be. An anesthesiologist would say they can turn it on and off. And apparently they do, but that still doesn't tell us what it is. And so my interest in it is in the broad scale. Every time you look at where anomalies arise in every area of science, that's providing a really important clue about the topic that you're studying. So I'm interested in the idea of consciousness as awareness, self-awareness, and just awareness in general. And what does it tell us when somebody can be aware of something which is not within reach of the ordinary senses, or worse, is in the future? So there's good evidence that that is possible. Well, how is that possible? That's what keeps my attention on this topic.
It seems like, in general, anomalies is how science progresses. When you see something that doesn't fit with your general understanding of X phenomena or X topic matter, you see something that stands out. That's how you make progress, isn't it?
That is the way the progress is made, and it is also completely predictable that people won't like it. The status quo doesn't like it at all. And even Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, said many years ago that when something new comes along, something novel, the very first reaction is, that's impossible. The second reaction is, well, maybe it's possible, but it's so weak that it doesn't really matter. And the third reaction is, oh, I thought of it first.
Are you able to get papers published? I know you are a member of SSC and some other organizations that are far more open to these kinds of subject matter. Are you able to get a paper like we're going to talk about with the genetics, get it published in general science publications?
Well, I would say more mainstream publications. So the answer is yes. It's not just myself, but my colleagues, the 2 or 3 dozen of us around the world who are active in this area, we're slowly beginning to penetrate the mainstream. And as usual, this is largely because the older we get, the younger the editors of the journals become, because they're typically in the middle of their career or the beginning of their career. And then some of the prejudices from the past that prevented publication in mainstream journals are beginning to go away. So it's partially a combination of what you said before, that consciousness is no longer a taboo word, combined with strangeness within quantum mechanics, which is suggesting that the nature of physical reality is not what we were thinking it was. And it's much more compatible than with the idea that some aspects of our experience are not just locked inside your head.
It's also true that science progresses, I guess, one funeral at a time. Famous saying, but it happens to be true.
It is true, yeah.
Let's talk about this title of a paper I saw that you had written, in the general subject matter being the genetics of psychic abilities, whether or not it runs in genetic lines, in family lines. Can you give me a general overview of why you started down this road and how you would even attempt to document something like that?
Well, every culture in the world has folklore about families where people seem to be psychic. So that would suggest that there is an element of the talent that is able to be inherited. That in turn suggests that there are genetics involved. So in the mid-90s, just before I came to UNLV, I was at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And one of the graduate students was doing her PhD on the hereditability of Scottish second sight, because I was in Scotland. And so she did interviews with families who said that they had second sight and was able to establish that it looked like there was something that was inherited. It wasn't just that the family supported the idea, but there was some actual inheritance. So from then until very recently, we didn't have the tools to be able to actually look at the genome and figure out if this was the case. So a few years ago, we decided to do an experiment. We raised funding to do it. And we're able to recruit 3,000 people around the world and then do structured interviews and tests to make sure that they were actually psychic from psychic families. And we narrowed it all down to 13 people who were reasonably sure were indeed had psychic talent and came from psychic families. And so that took a while. It took much longer to find 13 people as controls who never reported anything psychic and did not have anybody in their family report anything psychic. As it turned out, the 13 people we ended up with were all women, and it was very difficult to find 13 women who never reported anything psychic or that no one in their family did. That's what took a long time. So for each of the individuals, we got their DNA, ran the full genome, and then did a variety of bioinformatics type tests on it to compare the DNA and find out, are there any differences? Well, as it turned out, we found some differences. We're now raising funds to do a much larger study to confirm the results. But what we originally thought is that we would find that there would be differences in a positive direction, in a sense. So we'd find mutations in the psychics as compared to the controls, but actually it's the other way around. What we found is that the overall population was called, from a genetics perspective, the wild type. Like we're the average wild human out there. That's how most people are. But there are also variants out there. There are mutations. And so the subset that we found in our control group, who never reported any psychic abilities and no one in their family ever did, they are the mutants. They're the ones who are not the wild types. And so what we found also is that as you probably know, there's like 2 general categories of DNA. There's the coding portion, which is pretty small, and then there's a much, much larger portion which doesn't code for protein. And for a long time, we thought this non-coding part of DNA, we called it junk DNA because we didn't know what it was for. Well, now we're beginning to learn what it's for. It's basically, among other things, epigenetic switches that turn on aspects of genes. So it turns out that the sequence that we found in our control group was part of an intron sequence, non-coding sequence of DNA, which apparently either doesn't allow somebody to be psychic because it's not turning on certain genes, or we don't know yet, but there's something different about them than there is for the rest of us.
The bottom line of that is that most of us have some kind of psychic ability.
Most of us have at least the potential for having psychic ability. Yeah.
I was curious, what occurred to me is what might happen in your study, and I was just guessing, is the 13 control people might end up having some indication of psychic abilities, whether they had ever had it or not, whether they reported it or not.
It's possible, although as we usually find in the laboratory, unless somebody is naturally very talented and you ask them, did you ever have anything psychic happening? Most people will say yes. They might report just some spontaneous something that happened. They'll say, oh yes, there's one time something weird happened, but they don't think of themselves as psychic. As compared to this control group, which are extremely skeptical about psychic phenomena because no one they know and nor themselves have ever had these kinds of things. So they would look at the rest of us and say, those people are off the rocker because they're talking about things that don't happen. What they mean, of course, is don't happen to themselves.
Of these subjects who were not the control group, are you able to track back family stories, lore? Are there witches in some of their family background, or seers, or some notorious person in the family tree that had remarkable abilities along these lines?
We could do that, but we did not. It's simply a matter of the effort involved. So it took a long time, it took many months to be able to find the final 13. And 13 is a very small number to do any kind of study with. And it was completely a matter of how much money it costs to run the genome. So when we did this, it was about $1,000 to run each genome. And so you can see how quickly the amount of money starts exploding. Well, even since we've done that a couple of years ago, when we first got the data, you can now get it for like $250 or even $300. So the cost is rapidly dropping. So in our next round, we hope to get 100 in the psychic group and 100 matched controls at far less cost than we were originally working with. In fact, now it is more expensive to do the analysis than it is to actually get the genome.
What was the biggest surprise for you? Was the biggest surprise that it took so long to find the 13 in the control group?
That was one. The other is that we saw any difference at all in such a small group, because that suggests that there's actually quite a big difference. And the other surprise was that one of our people on the paper is interested in the sociology of genetic research. And through that, you're able to track historically where people who have different kinds of genetic makeups, where they lived. So it turns out, he just did it as an analysis, basically an exploratory analysis. Where in the world do you find people who have this particular variant that we found? And it turns out that there is a place in the world where that has the variant, which means that there is a deficit of people who are highly psychic. It turns out that at least within the sociogenetics world, that it is associated with Christianity. This means the Holy Roman Empire, plus or minus a couple of countries. That's like the density of where Christianity came from and where it evolved. And so we were thinking of that. I said, why would Christianity be associated with a deficit of these kinds of abilities? And then we thought, oh, the Inquisition. The Inquisition, which went on for a couple of hundred years, was finding people, some of whom probably were talented psychically, and getting rid of them. So this was a gigantic genetics test in historical terms, that if you begin to target people and get rid of them who have some talent, including a whole bunch of other people who are undoubtedly captured in the net, you can actually see the result eventually, as we can see now through genetic analysis. So that was kind of surprising too.
Wow. This is an impossible question for you to answer, given all that you have done, lab experiments to sort of measure these abilities. Can you give our listeners, our viewers, some kind of an idea of the experiments that you have done that are solid, that show a range of abilities for people that they might not otherwise assume that they have what we would call psychic abilities.
Are you asking of the kinds of abilities that,
yes.
that have been
yeah,
tested?
the kinds of abilities and how to quantify the statistical difference between the people you document this with and the general population.
Right. So, well, I guess I'll describe one experiment we've done repeatedly now that seems to work. So if you talk to professional chefs, oftentimes they will say, if you ask them privately, does it make a difference about the mood and emotions within the kitchen as to how people respond to the meal? Many that I've spoken to say, yeah, there's something about the intentions of the cooks and the emotions in the kitchen that people respond to differently. So this gave rise to a series of experiments that first began with, actually I did it myself at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, but later it turned into a whole series. And this had to do with, could you intentionally imprint and thereby change food or beverages in a way that people would later to be able to detect? And so the way we did it was, my colleague in Taiwan knows a Buddhist temple, and in many Buddhist temples, the senior monks are essentially professional meditators. They're what their job basically is to meditate a lot and then do things with it. So we asked them to imprint into water a blessing. Then the blessing would, the initial blessing was the water would be used later to make oolong tea in Taiwan. And so a big batch of oolong tea was made. Some of it was set aside with the water that was blessed, and the other was set aside with the same water, but that was not blessed. And the blessing was that anybody who drank the tea would have an improved mood. So we did an experiment where we recorded people's mood as they drank this tea over the course of a week. We saw a significant difference in the direction of having the blessed tea made a difference. Their mood was improved under double-blind conditions. So people who were drinking the same tea out of the same little bottles did not know what they were drinking, and yet their mood was better. And this is classic gold standard type of controlled experiment. So from that, the next step was, well, mood is a subjective response. Even though you can measure it and there's standardized ways of measuring it, I wonder if there's an objective effect. So we used a little plant called Arabidopsis thaliana, which is in the mustard family. It's a little weed. And the little weed is interesting because its genome was sequenced before the human genome. And it turns out that like most living creatures around the world have very similar DNA. So if this plant has a disease that's genetically based, it has an analog in humans. So the plants are used for studying genetic diseases without using humans for it. So it also turns out that there are various mutations that are understood about this plant. And in particular, all living systems on Earth have a protein called cryptochrome. So cryptochrome is interesting because it is a protein that is thought to have quantum properties. So we thought, okay, let's get a Arabidopsis plant that is a particular mutation where it overexpresses cryptochrome. So when there's blue light on it, the cryptochrome is activated, it overexpresses, it grows more. We thought, well, maybe that would be an interesting target to use for intention, because we think there may be a relationship between observing quantum systems, in this case, a protein, and the response of that system. So again, under double-blind conditions, the Buddhist monks have treated water. They have the same water that's not treated. The seeds are grown in the two water mediums. And then there's a variety of different measures you can take, one of which is called a hypocotyl. So the hypocotyl is the point where the stem begins from the seed up to the beginning of the leaves. So if it's short and fat, it means that it's a healthy plant because it's not using all of its energy to try to reach the surface or turn upside down or something. So a short, fat hypocotyl. We did 9 repetitions of the experiment and got extremely significant differences. terms of magnitude, it's only a matter of a couple of millimeters, but so many experiments and such precise results, we can tell there was a really significant difference in growth, better growth with the treated water or the blessed water. So then we just finished another series. Again, same through Buddhist monks, treating water, control water. This time we used human stem cells. So human stem cells is a living system. It has cryptochrome in it, but in particular, human stem cells are pragmatically important because you can use them. For example, they can be injected into a failing heart, and the stem cells will turn into heart cells and actually repair the heart. So the problem with human stem cells is that they lose their pluripotency, their stemness quality, the ability to turn into other cells. You can get them, but they lose that ability, the shape-shifting ability. So we wanted to see, could we make these cells proliferate more? Could they grow more? And also, would they maintain their stemness qualities? So that was the target in that case. And the short answer is yes. Very significant difference, both in the growth of the cells, the proliferation, and also in the way that they express to maintain the stemness qualities. So what we're moving towards here through a series of experiments is, first of all, does it do anything? Does it matter if you mentally try to make water better? The answer is yes, and we see it in multiple ways. But beyond that, I'm now much more interested in, well, why does it change? Like what's happening in the water, or what's happening just in general? That's becoming of more interest to me now.
A lot of your colleagues, people we know in common, have done a lot of research into what is called remote viewing. You recently wrote a paper, or were involved in an experiment about the non-local mind. I don't know if that's exactly the same as remote viewing. The public is generally aware of remote viewing and claims and abilities and government programs along those lines. Can you tell us about this recent paper you wrote about? It involves entangled photons, the non-local mind. Is that the same as remote viewing? And what did you find out?
Well, so remote viewing is the idea that your perception is not limited to your local space, not like your brain. So non-local mind is just a generic term used for the idea that our minds are not limited to space and time. They somehow transcend space and time. So when you do an experiment involving mind-matter interaction, it's kind of like remote viewing, except that you're interested not simply in perceiving something at a distance, but whether the distant thing changes as a result. So all kinds of different targets have been used over the years, from individual photons to random number generators to cell cultures to human behavior, all kinds of stuff. And in each case, we do see effects. So something about non-local mind seems to affect the world at large, but all of those targets were local in the sense that they were affecting a thing, like a localized thing. We decided to look at this a little more carefully because of two kinds of weirdnesses that show up in this realm. One is that psychic phenomena are weird, considered weird, because of the non-local factor. We feel usually pretty local, and yet we apparently are able to transcend that. And the other weirdness is in quantum mechanics, in which the notion of non-locality is central. So the question is, are these related or simply some kind of a strange coincidence? I think they're related to each other. So we did an experiment where the target of a non-local mind was non-local matter. And so the non-local matter that we worked with was entangled photons. We wanted to see whether the strength of entanglement is not simply there or not there, there's a spectrum of entanglement. We wanted to see if the strength of entanglement could be modulated by the mind, non-local mind. So we got a device that produces non-local or entangled photons, about 1,000 non-local or entangled photons per second. 30 years ago, it would have cost $10 million to do this experiment because it's not so easy to create these entangled photons. Now it costs a few tens of thousands of dollars because there's a device that you can put on your desktop, which will actually do that. You get entangled photons to work with. So We did an experiment where we gave people feedback, real-time feedback about the strength of entanglement. And you can see in a graph, it kind of goes up and down. But we told people to try to make the graph go up, which would mean that the entanglement strength was increasing. And so they did the experiment. We did 3 experiments at IONS where I work, Noetic Sciences, and then a colleague in France did the same experiment at his place. So the final analysis was the 3 experiments we did at IONS had extremely strong evidence that, in fact, entanglement strength went up when people were trying to make it go up, and under control conditions, it didn't do anything, just stayed the same. My colleague in France did not get those results. His result didn't work. The reason why this is important is that we, of course, obviously need to do follow-up experiments and get other people to do this. But leading edge ideas within physics now is asking the question about what is space and time? And previously we thought, well, these are fundamentals, they're simply there. Well, after Einstein, we see that they're actually a relationship. Now it's beginning to be seen that space and time actually might emerge out of the property of entanglement, which means quantum entanglement is more fundamental even than relativistic physics. So space and time are created. If the mind can influence entanglement, it means that when we are targeting a system at a distance, we're changing space-time at that location. So it puts a slightly new spin on the idea of why is it that mind-matter interaction affects work? Previously, it was thought that maybe we mentally can adjust the probabilities of events. That still may be true. But it may also now be true that we can mentally manipulate space-time itself. If that is true, and we can confirm that through many more studies, it would suggest that there's some aspect of consciousness which actually is more fundamental in the physical world. That I don't mean humans, but some aspect of our awareness is somehow involved in the creation of physicality as we can perceive it.
Meaning that the universe is here for our benefit, to observe it? Is it there without it? Is that going too far?
Well, that's asking a why question.
Yeah.
So we don't know the why. We can't answer the why question, but we can begin to answer the how question, which is, well, what is causing this structure to appear in the first place? So I make a distinction between consciousness with a little c, which is what I feel like it's going on in there, and consciousness with a big C, which is like a universal consciousness. So I think maybe that our individual consciousness is part of a much larger consciousness. The much larger consciousness would have, if these experiments are correct, and if the esoteric literature is correct, all of which says that there is a big C out there somehow, then somehow we're involved at least in the participation of how the universe exists and how it unfolds.
I'm trying to remember from all the books and papers that I've read of yours over the years, whether you've ever documented or studied precognition. I'm thinking of all the people who had claimed they had a sense of dread before, say, 9/11, or people who had fragments of dreams that later they thought was an indication that something really bad was coming. Anything along those lines that you've been able to document?
Well, so when I was at UNLV, one of the experiments I started, I called presentiment. So it was a very simple experiment where you sit somebody down in front of a computer, they look at a series of pictures, some of which are all of them are randomly selected, but some are very emotional and some are very calm. And meanwhile, we're recording physiology. So recording heart rate and skin conductance and that sort of thing. And in later years, also pupil dilation and EEG and like the whole body. And the idea was that many people report a feeling of something that's about to unfold. So they don't know it, they don't cognize it, but they feel it, thus the word presentiment. And so we figured if that were true, then maybe we would see a change in somebody's physiology before an emotional picture comes up, and that would be different than before a calm picture comes up. So we did a series of experiments, we got really good results, so good that my colleagues didn't believe it. So they started doing their own replications and they were able to replicate it. So go forward 30 years almost, and there are now something like 48 experiments done by labs around the world. And it's very clear that it is a repeatable effect, that what we see is for different kinds of physiology, different time lengths. So if you're looking at skin conductance, roughly 3 seconds in advance of some unpredictable event, you will begin to see a change in skin conductance, which is a reflection of sympathetic nervous activity. You see a change about 1 second for brain activity. You see a change of about 7 or 8 seconds in heart rate, in pupil dilation, about 2 seconds. So the time length, or the pre-length, the pre-stimulus period, seems to reflect the way the physiology goes. So why does heart rate take longer? Well, because it takes a lot longer to respond to a stimulus. And skin conductance and all the other factors we're seeing beforehand is almost like an echo, a pre-echo of what you see afterwards. So that's a line of experiments that I didn't really start them. I picked them up after they had lain fallow for almost 20 years. And finally, the technology was good enough to be able to do it at a more refined form. And people have picked it up since then. And now it's quite clear that there's something going on.
One other topic I want to touch on while we have you here. I know you are not a UFO guy. You keep abreast of it because of colleagues of yours who are interested in it. Jacques Vallée, Eric Davis, and others have commented and written about UFO events and the consciousness-related activities, that there are also psychic phenomena associated with when we see these things. We just interviewed a couple of guys who are summoners. They're not Stephen Greer disciples. They go out and they mentally focus on the sky, and a pretty good percentage of the time things appear. They're not classic flying saucers, they're globs, weird stuff. Are you at all interested in that? Are you up on that? Do you have any sort of central ideas or theories about consciousness as it relates to UFO events and vice versa?
Yeah, I've tracked the literature for a long time, and I know most of the main players in it. I guess I fall into the Jacques Vallée school here, in that I think what we're dealing with, at least with some UFOs, is what amounts to an imaginal world. It's the world that's somehow halfway in between physics and psychology. And given all of the other studies that I've done and colleagues have done on looking at the relationship between mind and matter, it seems as though if you really, really want something to happen, focused intention, the likelihood that it's going to happen simply increases. So if one with focused attention wants a blob of light to appear, and they do it a lot and they have practice on it, and they have to have a little bit of talent, the likelihood that a blob of light is going to appear. The question is, well, is that a separate entity? Is it like an actual UFO? Is it an ET? What is that? Well, we don't know what that is. But I do pay attention to these things. In fact, just historically, the reason why I like the way that Jacques puts this is that people have been reporting these kinds of events forever, basically. There's even a website devoted to fairies or the little people, where there's hundreds and hundreds of reports. What's interesting is that, first of all, the reports seem real. These are not all being made up. People do see little things. They tend to see them in places where they expect to see them. So some of it is expectation, or our perceptions are driven by expectation. But I think some of it also is that the world is more flexible than we generally think. That from a classical physics perspective, everything out there is solid, like nothing's happening. Well, we know that space and time are flexible. In quantum mechanics, we know that there's much more interconnectedness than we thought. It has something to do with consciousness. So the idea that people are seeing things that are doing behavior that we don't understand very well, that seems more mind-like than machine-like, to me, this begins to make a certain degree of sense. It's as though we are projecting out of our minds all of it, including things that don't make physical sense because they weren't starting from physicality in the first place. So, yeah, so that's my take on it. But ultimately, when people say, well, are there really the ETs and all the rest? I don't know.
I would think it would be encouraging to some degree in that suddenly in the last couple of years, UFOs have become at least a little bit respectable in the media, in Congress. And I would hope that would spill over into what you do as well.
Well, I would hope so too. So you notice, though, that the way that it's spilling over is in terms of military threat, right? This is what makes people pay attention. There could be a threat. Well, that's what gets gets the money going. I think most people involved in the UFO business, even ones interested in military threats, realize that some of this has to do with elements of the mind that we don't understand very well. So yes, it would be very nice if some of that interest were to at least begin to entertain the possibility that consciousness is related in some way to these kinds of phenomena, and probably a whole array of other things as well.
Dean Radin, great to talk to you always. What's your latest book? I want to give it a plug to our viewers who are interested in your work.
My latest book is called Real Magic.
That's right.
And it's looking at the whole range of esoteric lore, both East and West, and showing that one of the reasons why these phenomena are considered strange is because we come from a worldview that doesn't admit it, right? We come from a materialistic worldview, which is really good, except when it comes to consciousness. So 300 or 400 years of materialism, tens of thousands of years of the esoteric worldview, which is very different, and where things like UFOs and magic and all the rest of it is perfectly normal. So I wrote the book to point out that we're using a relatively new way of viewing the world, and there are other ways of viewing it as well.
Well, it's a great read. I read it a couple of years ago when it came out. I recommend it highly, and you're always welcome here or on Coast to Coast whenever you want to come back and have something new to talk about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.